Hello relatives, welcome to this week's Schlagbite for the week October 29th, 2010, entitled Healing Wounds. I've just returned from my annual teaching tour in Germany, and every time I go, I learn something that heals my soul. I've written about the seminal influence in my life that being the firstborn son of Holocaust survivors has meant. How my attitudes toward suffering, my feeling of responsibility for others, my attitudes toward power, privilege, and authority have all been determined by that accident of birth. I've spent my professional life as a physician, a psychiatrist, because I felt a calling to relieve suffering. It turned out it was clearly as well to heal myself from old wounds. Going to Germany yearly over the last 20 years has liberated me from my more dysfunctional manifestations, like my judgementalism, anger, cynicism, and mistrust. And this year I returned to my parents' small hometown for the second time. I'd been here 32 years before, and this year I was on my way to Heidelberg, where I was going to address a meeting of 1,000 mental health professionals. I thought I'd make a brief visit to the cemetery. It was just off the highway, say prayers for my grandparents, and then continue on for my spa date. 32 years ago, when I was in Felsberg, it had 2,500 people in 2 streets. It's now 3 times the size, there are lots of streets, and it's a manicured suburbia. The first 2 people I asked where the Jewish cemetery was were under 50, they had no idea. I stopped to ask an elderly woman who was outside in her garden, and she said, "It's right behind my house, and you can come through my garden. Just leave your car right there." I went, I said my prayers, I walked around, and after 20 minutes was ready to leave. Walking back through the garden, the woman was still out there working. As I approached, she asked who I was, and I told her my name, which she immediately recognized. It's an old family name in this village, but acknowledged that she didn't know any members of my family personally. I told her the only person I remembered from my last visit was the brother of my father's closest friend. And he had guided us through the village when I was first there. She told me that the man had died many years ago, and then I remember that after our tour he took us to the home of his niece, Elspeth. She was the daughter of my father's closest friend. I asked her if Elspeth was still alive, and she looked stunned. She said that Elspeth is my best friend, and yesterday was her 75th birthday. It gave me goosebumps. The woman, who in typical German formal fashion never told me her first name, said she'd call Elspeth because she wouldn't open the door for strangers. And when Elspeth answered the phone, her friend said there was someone from America here to see her by the name of Hammerschlag. Well, Elspeth welcomed me with tears and hugs, and of course she told me I would sit down. She didn't care where I was going on my spa date. She would bring some bread, which in Germany means it's accompanied by sausage and liverwurst and cheese, and the remnants of yesterday's birthday party pastries. The spa afternoon was history, but it was an Epicurean return to my childhood, and we reveled in old family stories. Her son Frank walked in unexpectedly and joined the conversation. I'd last seen him, he was 18 years old, when he accompanied his uncle and me while he was showing us the Jewish history of this town. There was lots of nostalgia, lots of laughter, and some tears. And when I was ready to leave, Elspeth brought out a letter that my father had written to her father in November 1936. It was shortly after his arrival in New York City. I'd heard this letter 32 years ago, and I remembered it saying that my father would never again come back to Germany, but he had hoped they might again sit around the table as friends. This time I heard the letter differently. I had forgotten that it was mostly a newsy letter to his friend, a letter that told about his journey about leaving home, how he arrived in Paris and then on to Cherbourg, where he boarded the ship for the transatlantic journey, He wrote about his emotional response to looking at the Statue of Liberty for the first time, and said to his friend that if he worked as hard as he did in Germany, in the United States, that he'd be a rich time by the time he was 50, because Americans spent a lot of time relaxing. It was only at the end that he said that he didn't think it was likely he'd ever come back to Germany, and that he hoped they would one day still gather around the table. This visit, I spent less time weeping at the remains of my ancestral roots, and most of it celebrating connections as extended family around that table of my father's dreams. It reminds me again of how important it is to look again at old certainties, because that's the way we continue to write new endings to our old stories. Healing my unforgiving wounds here in Felsberg, I felt my father's smile. Those are my thoughts, relatives. Have a great week. Remember, we're all connected. Doesn't matter where we are. Find ways to remind yourself that we are never alone. Look again at what you know. I say this for all my relations. Mitakuyasi.